All right, hello, good morning, everyone. We are going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the webinar. So you want to start a library podcast. My name is Courtney Brown, and I'm the Southeast Regional Coordinator from the Indiana State Library's Professional Development Office. I'll be the host and question moderator today. Our presenter this morning is Dr. Curtis Rogers, Communications Director for the South Carolina State Library. So I'm going to start off with a few announcements. To register for other webinars or other trainings available from the Professional Development Office, please see the Indiana State Library's events calendar, which can be found on our website at www.in.gov/library. For a full list of our current in-person training menu, please see our continuing education website. If you have a question, just type it in the chat box on the upper left side of the screen, and I'll be watching. I'll get your questions to Dr. Rogers at the end of the presentation. The session will be about an hour, so you'll get one TLEU for today. After the presentation is ended, please stay logged in to download your TLEU. I'll also be posting a link to a survey about the presentation. Please fill that out and let us know how we're doing. I'll also share that with Dr. Rogers as well. So again, please stay logged in at the end of the presentation for access to your TLEU and the survey link. If you're watching an archived recording of this webinar, instructions on how to obtain your LEU are in the video's description on YouTube. If at any point during the webinar you experience any sound issues, please see the sound issues box just below the chat box on the left side of the screen. If there's a global sound issue, we will announce it in the chat box. If you're unable to resolve your sound issues you're experiencing, we are recording this meeting and you can watch it online after it's ended. So now I will turn the presentation over to Dr. Rogers.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you all today from sunny South Carolina. Actually, we've already had a few days over 100, so today is only a high of 88. So I'm happy for the cool respite. But anyway, hope everyone is doing well in Indiana. And again, it's a pleasure to be with you today. I'm going to go ahead and click on these slides that I've got here. So just to give you an outline of what I'm going to be talking about today, I'll give you kind of an overview of the history of how we've come about our podcast, which is called Library Voices SC. And I'm going to talk to you about the equipment that we use and how we go about selecting topics and the whole process essentially of podcasting. And we'll get into editing recordings, and the only podcasting service that I have ever used is Podbean, so that's what I'm going to be discussing with you. And also we'll talk about how to promote your podcast and how you share it. And before I go any further, I would love to know where folks are from in Indiana. So if you type in your chat box where you're viewing from, I always think that's interesting to see where folks are from. And also that way I know that you can hear me. Oh, we've got some folks from out of state too. Wow, even in Idaho. That's great. Very cool. Tennessee, Texas, Kansas, Georgia, Virginia. Wow, very cool. I was just going to be talking to Indiana folks, but I see we've got folks from everywhere. So great. Thank you all for joining us today. Here is a screenshot on the right that you can see is just kind of a view of what you get when you have a podcast and you have it set up, and you see there are tags over on the right. I love to use tags in all of my episodes, and you can see there's one of the latest episodes we have, which is about assistive technology, and it gives the URL, so you can see how many downloads are here, and you can also see that says 92 episodes, but here's 82. And that's a little bit of a difference there, and I'll explain that in a little while because we've had some other episodes that have gone under kind of a different numbering system. So moving right along, just to tell you a little bit about my presentation style. Basically, I'm just going to be talking about my experience with this podcast, Library Voices SC, and kind of let you know my thoughts about it and how I go about doing everything. And I will give a disclaimer that I am by no means an expert. I kind of know enough to be dangerous and to get the podcast together and get everything out. So if you have any detailed technical questions, I may have to take a note and get back to you at another time, but I'll certainly be glad to help. Also, what I want you to understand the most is just the basics so that you can get started. When I started doing this, it was a big learning curve. And so once I got the basics down and was able to get started, I continued learning throughout the process of actually putting a podcast together. So some things kind of really had to learn on my own, and some things just became intuitive. And the big thing I think about podcasting is that you have to also listen to podcasts if you're going to have a podcast, because then you can kind of pick up ideas and things to know for what you're doing or what you may need to change doing. Also, if you have any questions, please save them for the end. I will definitely give folks some time at the end of the presentation to ask questions, and I will try to answer them all then. So as I'm going through my slides, if you think of a question, go ahead and jot it down, or go ahead and type it in, and we'll just get to those later at the end. Okay, so how it all started. We've actually been doing the Library Voices SC podcast for, I think, going on 3 years. And you can go back and listen to some of the early episodes and see how it's changed over time. We have 2 staff members who have moved on to other positions at other libraries and other agencies. But Pamela Hoppock and Katie Simmons were the 2 individuals on our staff who decided to just start doing a podcast. And I think it was Pamela who had been to a webinar or something about podcasting and decided to go ahead and get this started. Since I'm the communications director, it kind of had to be approved by me, so I wanted to be sure that, you know, they were talking about the right things, and we had disclaimers, we had all kinds of things in place, because sometimes you never know if you get someone who's going to be interviewed what their positions are on certain things. And the nice thing is you can always edit stuff, so never had to deal with anything that controversial, but that's something that you might want to keep in the back of your mind. And you can see the picture over on the right. This is a H4n Pro Zoom recorder, a handy recorder, and this is actually what we started out using. Sometimes you would hear some echo if you were in a very closed room. Sometimes the 2 little mics at the top weren't turned the right way, because you can turn them 90 degrees, 45 degrees, and get all these different effects. So it's really kind of neat, but that was a learning curve just in and of itself to figure out how to use that little recorder and then how to edit it. So if you are thinking about getting started using something like a handheld recorder, there are all kinds of things out there. You can also record directly to an iPad. You can use that as a podcasting medium. So there are all kinds of things out there. We did decide early on that we would use Podbean as our podcasting mechanism, our tool. And the nice thing is that it's relatively inexpensive. A year subscription is only $108, so that archives everything, and it's really nice. The Zoom recorder was around $200, so getting started at about $300 is really not a big deal. For some people, it is a big deal, but you can certainly get started for around $300 or so. Also, it's a good idea to have a meeting room that is dedicated. now we have a podcasting studio, but we use the podcasting studio for a number of other things, recording other um, things, maybe voiceovers for video, that kind of thing. But we had this meeting room that wasn't being used, and so that's where we kind of just started, and then it kind of morphed into its own little podcasting studio. Um, so talk a little bit about the equipment that we have. Once we changed the meeting room into an actual podcasting studio, I met with our IT director, and for those of you there in Indiana, we have a supplier out of Fort Wayne. Yeah, I see Suzanne saying Sweetwater is a wonderful Indiana company. Yes, they certainly are. They're actually on state contract here in South Carolina, so our IT department is able to get lots of great equipment from them, and we also are able to get lots of assistance if we have questions. So all of the equipment that I ended up getting to turn this meeting room, this small meeting space, and you're going to see pictures of it shortly, into a podcast studio, ended up costing around $2,400. And for that, we had to, I just kind of trusted the judgment of our IT director, and he kind of told me all the stuff that I would need. I kind of had an idea because I had seen pictures of podcasting studios, and you can see the microphones, and you can see how the room is set up, and you, of course, are going to need a computer and software. So what Sweetwater came back to us with was all of this information that you see here, and that included the boom arms and the vocal mics and the cables and everything. So it was nice to be able to have someone with that experience being able to consult with Sweetwater to figure out exactly what we need. And I see someone is asking, can we have a copy of your slides? Yes, I have sent them to Courtney, so you all will be able to have access to those. So one of the other things that I thought was really going to be important for this room that we're turning into a podcast studio were the acoustic panels. And this just helps make the room a lot more quiet. And I'll show you pictures of how those work. And these are just standard fabric acoustic panels. You can see they're $35 each. The thing that took the most time was getting our general services staff from state government, and some of you are at county libraries or maybe academic libraries, and you know what it's like when you have to put in a request for someone to maybe do any kind of adjustment to the facility. So I think it took about 10 days or 2 weeks to get someone to come over and actually install the acoustic panels. And I wasn't here when they installed them, so of course they installed them in a very odd configuration on the wall. But it ended up being fine. Things just tend to work out. So anyway, one of the things you're going to need to think about if you do want to set up an actual studio is the sound. Is the room near another area of the library or whatever facility you're in? Is it near anything else that may be loud or may be distracting? Is the air conditioning or the HVAC loud in the room, and will that create any kind of issues with recording? Oh, yes, Suzanne. Yes, I am in the podcast studio now. Thank you. Glad I'm coming through loudly and clearly. But anyway, so you have to kind of think of all these little things when you're setting up a kind of studio so that you can make sure that the quality of audio is really high quality. If you go back and listen to very old versions when we were using the Zoom handheld recorder, you can see a big difference in the audio from when we were using the handheld recorder to when we're using the professional mics with the booms and you know, all of the kind of things that make it a much more professional sound. So here is a picture of our setup, and you can see over on the wall some of those acoustic panels. You can also see on the wall here in the back there is an air intake, and that has never been a problem, which is good. You can also see there is a telephone. If you're going to have a telephone in the room, which I think is very helpful, I'm able to actually move this third microphone over to that as a speakerphone, and that's how someone can call in if I'm interviewing someone who cannot get to Columbia. It's only happened a few times. Usually people are here in town, or if they're doing a presentation here at the library and I want to include them in a podcast episode, then it just works out great to be able to have a telephone. The only thing I had to remember is that I have to keep that telephone ringer on mute. So if you're in the middle of doing a recording, you don't want the telephone in the background to start ringing. So it's only used in case I have to call someone who is calling in and actually doing the podcast remotely. So you can see here we've got 3 microphones, and I wonder if anybody can kind of recognize what kind of table this is. Some of you might recognize what kind of table this is because it was an index table. It used to have a big thing down the middle with, old card catalog table, and I think we had also all the Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature on some kind of shelf that was here in the middle. So you can see what they did here. They drilled a hole back here, and they drilled another hole here and another hole here, and they kind of retrofitted it so that we could use the mics, which was very nice. So here's another shot of the acoustic panels, and I had kind of seen everything about the acoustic panels as them having some room in between each one, and for some reason they put these all up in one big, just one big area without any spaces. So it still works fine, but I think I would have wanted them to have some space in between to spread them out along the wall. So here's another shot. We also have used this room to do some video, so that's kind of why you see this table back here. We can pull it out, put a chair behind it, rearrange stuff, set up a video camera, and it's nice that we have the ability to have a quiet atmosphere, so that works too. You can also see there is a fan in here, which I don't have on, but sometimes this room can get a little stuffy, and so if I'm preparing for a podcast and I'm going to have 2 or 3 or 4 people being interviewed all at the same time, I'll go ahead and kind of turn the fan on just to get the room, the air circulated a little bit before, and then turn it off while the podcast is actually taking place. So this is the Focusrite. That's all I call it, is the Focusrite, because all it does is it takes all of the microphones in, and this is where I turn on the microphones. And I also tend not to touch a lot of the buttons here, so I don't really worry that much if about everything that this does. I kind of keep my hands off of it. The only thing I press is this button and this button to turn on the microphones. So you can see here, this is microphone 1, microphone 2, and microphone 3 and 4. So microphone 1 and 2 is how I turn on this button, and then microphones 3 and 4, I use this button to turn on. So this is the software that I use, and it is, and of course I can't remember the exact name, but I will get to it. This is the software that came with all of the hardware, and basically all I do when I'm on here is I make sure that if this is microphone 1, I make sure that it's recording microphone 2 or 3, so I only have 3 microphones set up, so I would turn those on here, and I can make any adjustments that I need. Also, while people are talking, I can see their levels, the sound levels here, to see whether or not it's coming through okay. I also have a headphone set in this room so that while people are talking into their mics, I can put that headphone on and hear what every microphone is hearing. You also notice that this computer has a webcam. So like I mentioned, this room is used for a number of different things. For instance, today doing this webinar, if any of our staff need a quiet place to either give a webinar or watch a webinar, we have some staff members who are in cubicles, so it's might be nicer for them to reserve the podcast studio to listen to a webinar or participate in an online meeting. So all they have to do is reserve it on our agency calendar and let folks know that they're going to need it at a certain time. So once we created the studio, we wanted to make sure that all of the staff had access to it. And for some of our staff, it has really come in handy, especially if they need a quiet place, because some of our staff have are located right next to a window, which is right next to a street, which if a, you know, fire truck goes by or an ambulance goes by, then everyone is going to hear that. So that may be something that you want to think about if you're actually going to be choosing a location in your library or your facility to set up a studio. Think of its proximity to outside noise. This podcast studio that I'm in right now is actually in the basement, and the only thing adjoining it is our computer training lab, and that tends to be very quiet because there's a very thick wall between the two of us, so it seems to work out just fine. Oh, Studio One, that's the name of the software that I use to make the recordings. This is a close-up of one of the mics. You can see how it can rotate. You can move it all around, and it makes life very easy. The booms are very easy to move, and that's something that when I have a guest in, I, talk to them about how to get the mic, about 5 inches or so away from their mouth. And usually if you hold up your hand and you fold down your 3 middle fingers and you're left with your thumb and your pinky, that's about the distance you want. And if you put your thumb on your chin, then stick your pinky out, you can see that's about how much, yes, exactly, just like in the King's Speech. That's about how much distance you want to have between your mouth and the microphone. And so anytime I have someone in the podcast studio, I tell them that's kind of what you need to think. And I have some people who kind of move away or shy away from the mic, and I just reassure them, just don't worry. I can cut out everything. I can fully edit everything later. If you cough or if you say a whole sentence that you don't like, just tell me to cut it out, and we can go from there. And that usually sets people at ease. So one of the things I wanted to mention about a mouse, you can see the Logitech keyboard. I have a wireless keyboard and a wireless mouse, but I didn't have the wireless mouse for a while. And I was using the touchpad, and the touchpad a few times actually caused me to mess up the recording because my finger really wasn't situated to using the touchpad correctly. Some people really like touchpads. For some reason, they just don't work with my brain and my hand-eye coordination. So I requested from our IT department if a mouse could be added, and within 5 minutes there, I had a nice wireless mouse. The only thing I have to remember to do is turn it off and turn it on. But that's something to think about logistically. If if other people are going to be using the studio and doing recordings, then it makes sense to have different options, because some people might like the touchpad, some people might prefer an actual mouse with a tracker ball on it. So that's something to think about. Another thing that I had to remember was to put signage on the door. I, at one point, without having a sign on the door, was, in here, and even though it was posted to our agency calendar and everyone has access to the agency calendar, that doesn't necessarily mean that everyone is looking closely at the agency calendar. So I actually had the director of our University of South Carolina School of Medicine library in doing a podcast talking about medical librarianship, and all of a sudden someone opened the door. So that reminded me that I needed to have some kind of signage on the door to say, and I usually don't like to put things in red, bold, all caps, but it's something that I had to be able to um, put on the door so that people would notice. So I just put podcast in progress, do not disturb, unless there is an emergency. Of course, if we have a tornado or something, I want us to be able to get out. So otherwise, pretty much everything I have kind of turned off so that I don't get disturbed. So one of the things I had to do, and you'll notice this is on an old catalog card because I like to recycle those. I had to write myself just a basic set of notes on all of the things that I have to do kind of in a process so that I know what I'm doing when I am starting to record a podcast. So I have to open the Studio One software. I have to click on Create New Song. I have to select this certain audio box 1818, which is just part of the software. I have to be sure to turn on the microphones at the mixer. I call that the Focusrite, the mixer. I have to test the sound. I have to turn on mics both on the bottom of the screen. So in the software, you have to turn on the mics there. And then I have to hit the record button. And then lastly, I have to export the mix down. So all of those steps I had to kind of figure out, and I figured out most of that just on a YouTube video on using the Studio One software, and also working with someone in our IT department at that time. And so it always helped me to kind of have this note right next to the equipment so that I would remember each time what I was doing, because sometimes I might only do a couple of podcasts in a month. Depending on interest or what's going on, or other duties as assigned, because as the communications director I supervise our public information coordinator and our user experience designer. So there's a lot of other things going on with press releases and newsletters and email marketing that I have to pay attention to. So might be 1 month I do 4 podcast episodes. Might be 1 month I do 1 podcast episode. So you have to kind of think about how regularly you're going to be able to do things. One of the things I've done recently is I had, and I'll show you in a moment, but I had one of our staff members in our Talking Book Services department for blind and visually impaired suggest doing a series on assistive technology. And so right now I've already published part 1 of that 3-part series. She knew the 3 people that she wanted to invite, so I worked with her, and we set up the different days and times. And on one day I had 2 of them come back to back, so in 1-hour segments. And so I knocked out all the recordings, and then later on I decided, well, we'll use this certain month to get the rest of those published, just kind of spacing them out a week at a time, and then I'll worry about who else I'm going to get for future episodes. But anyway, I'm always asking a lot of our staff, if you have any ideas of any kind of podcast ideas, just feel free to let me know, and I'll be happy to work with that. So you will be happy to know I did make this a sign in our podcast studio instead of it being on handwritten and on a catalog card. And those of you who may have attended my webinar I did on signage, I'm all about kind of making sure that the signage is pretty good and useful. So anyway, I put this here because we do have a few other staff actually using the Studio One software to make a recording for whatever purpose. And then there's all the information that was on that other card. So one of the other things that I noticed is I came into the podcast studio a few times and the wireless keyboard and the wireless mouse were left on. So I figured I will go ahead and make a sign to just remind folks when they're using the podcast studio to go ahead and turn those off. And that has helped. So one of the other things to think about, and I think I had gotten this compiled from a few academic libraries who were heavy into podcasting, and so I kind of borrowed heavily from their published podcasting guidelines so that we would have a set of guidelines here at the state library. So you can see this just kind of gives the purpose and the rationale and gives a little policy statement. Also see, since we're a state government agency, the state library podcasting resources cannot be used in a manner that violates law for political campaigning, personal gain, or activities that are not approved by the library. So one of the things about personal gain, that's kind of difficult when you're talking about an author who you may be interviewing because, of course, they're trying to sell their books. So that kind of, we think that we're all about books, and we maybe have their books in our library collection. So the library is buying the book. However, the author is still trying to make a living. So those are kind of things that you need to think about. Of course, the no political campaigning or anything that violates law. Talk about storage and how the uh, podcast is archived, and you can see we say that these are edited and posted to podbean.com. And what I also do is have all of the recordings on a shared drive on the main network. So we have an internal um, file sharing system, and all of the raw recordings are there saved, and also all of the completed Audacity files are saved before they are uploaded to the Podbean account. You can see here is also information about recording a podcast, just the real basic kinds of things that someone logging into the Studio One software needs to have their settings saved as. Has here primary state library staff members hosting the podcast are the communications director and the user experience designer. So additional staff members may be asked to assist with interviews on an as-needed basis, just kind of your general language. We also talk about the importance of tagging because it is very important to tag any podcast so that it can be found easily later, and that none of them should be marked as uncategorized. This is one of those very librarian things that we like to do. So, we can have different tags. Tags can be created on the fly. Just have to think about subject headings. Also, if you're doing like a little mini series, like we have one called Bibliobservatory, which now has 5 episodes, and each one is tagged Bibliobservatory. So when you click on that tag, you will get all of those episodes that are in that kind of sub-series. Talking about the artwork and the website and also podcast pages. So all of that information is things you want to think about. This image right here, you can see is actually the image that is in our footer on every page of our website, which lists our social media, and we do include the podcast link right there so that people can access it from our website on every single page. So, talking to you quickly about selecting topics. Of course, book talks and authors are great to have on the podcast. We're libraries for the most part, and we like to promote reading and authors. So, if you ever have authors who come into your library, excuse me, I'm going to get some water. If you have authors coming in, what I tend to do is whoever is working with the author that they're bringing in to do a book talk or something here at the state library, I always contact them and I say, um, you know, do you think this person would be interested in doing a podcast with me? And can I have their email address and introduce myself and say, here's a link to our podcast. We'd love to have you join us while you're here. I can, if, depending on my schedule too, could you do it before your presentation, your book talk, or after your book talk? And that usually it really works out fine. I had one recent author here who I happen to know, and I've had for the second time on the podcast. So he was already kind of used to it. He had another book out, and so I wanted to be sure and get him in. So anytime we have guests here at the library, I try to figure out if I can get them into a podcast episode, interview them about something library related. And then, of course, you also have a lot of the months that are specific. You've got Black History Month, Women's History Month, National Poetry Month. I had found out that October was, I think, Medical Library Awareness Month or something like that. So that's when I had the director of the local medical library come out and do a podcast episode, which actually then was neat. After I published that, which I think I published it the same day and sent it to her, she sent it on to the National Medical Library Network. I forget what that's called, and they ended up putting it in their blog. And it's just a great way to not only promote what it is you do, but also promote your library and promote your library's activities. Since everything is electronic, you can, easily get that out there through, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all that kind of stuff. One of the other things we have focused on is South Carolina specific history. We have a good partnership with the University of South Carolina Press, and they tend to publish a lot of books that are South Carolina specific. So I get in touch with them and see if they have any folks who might want to be interviewed. And we also have someone else on staff who works with them to get authors to come and do book talks. Also educational, anything educational or related to genealogy, those are good topics. And you just have to kind of brainstorm and think about what other topics might be useful to your local community and what people might be interested. Oh, thank you, George. The National Network of Libraries of Medicine. Yes, that's exactly it. And so you just have to kind of think of all those topics that might be of interest to your community. Since we're a state library, I tend to think a lot of statewide. So you can see here on this screen, I had actually a mother and son do a book of poetry, and they were here in the library, and so I interviewed both of them. Also, it was during Poetry Month. I had a poet from the upstate of South Carolina. She called in. She couldn't get to Columbia during the month because she was so busy. So I had her call in, and she did a great podcast episode. We also had someone from the University of South Carolina Herbarium come and do an urban botany talk. And so I invited him to do a podcast episode. And you could see at that time there were 139 downloads, and I'm sure it's much more now. And okay, Karen, I just noticed your question. Sometimes I publish one a month, sometimes I've published 4 or 5 a month, so it just kind of runs the gamut. So the podcasting process, select your topic. You have to coordinate your day and time with your guest. You also have to make them comfortable, make them feel at ease about the podcasting process. If I have to book our podcasting studio, I post it on the calendar, make sure other staff know when it's going to be used. I also like to get biographical information for the script, and I do have a script. I'll show you that on the next slide. And I also want to always ensure that it's a casual conversation. when you're doing an interview with someone in the podcast studio and you've got all this equipment around, you really, you kind of want to make eye contact. You want to ask them lots of questions, and you have to kind of be a good conversationalist. So that's something to think about. You have to also press the record button and make sure the microphones are on. I have that in all caps as a little joke to myself because I did get one person in here to do a episode, and I realized as I was trying to do the mix down and the editing that I couldn't really hear her that well. Well, I had failed to hit one extra little button and her microphone wasn't actually on. So she was very gracious, local person. She came back. I said, so sorry. But thankfully, I've only made that mistake once. Um, and then I use Audacity, which is free software. I use that for the production side. So I only use the Studio One to record, and then I use Audacity to produce. I'm just more familiar with Audacity. And then post and share and promote. So here is an example of a podcast script. This was one that I did with the children's author, Catherine Otoshi. She was here in town, and so I was able to get on her schedule so that I could get her to come in. And I always do, I tend to clear the discussion topics with the individual. So you can see here I've got, how did you first get interested in writing children's book? Tell us about this certain book that she has, what she did while she was here, working with children, that kind of thing. So you do have to do a little bit of research about the person, what they do, and so that you can have enough to talk about. So you can see here is the little script, and I always jokingly say that I turn on my podcast voice for doing this. So when I start, I would say, welcome to the South Carolina State Library's podcast, Library Voices SC. I'm Curtis Rogers, Communications Director, and today I'm pleased to have with us in our studio Catherine Otoshi. Catherine is an award-winning author and illustrator best known for her character-building number and color book series 1, 0, and 2. So you can see I kind of have changed my voice so that I have a lot more inflection because I tend to be a little monotone, and I have to really focus on using inflections when I'm doing this because it's being recorded. So I probably should have done that more throughout this webinar. But anyway, so you can see I also have links. So for this, in this case, for Catherine Otoshi, she has an author page, and I also noticed she had a pretty good following on Goodreads, so I included a link here. And then I always have the same closing script. Thank you for being with us today, and wait for the person to say thank you. It's been great to be here, and you can see here I also say you can find Library Voices SC on Podbean, Stitcher, and TuneIn Radio, or add us on your favorite podcast app. I give our website address, libraryvoices.podbean.com, so I always say that. And I always say that, we love hearing from our listeners, so please send us your comments and suggestions for future topics. So I just have that little outro that I can say every time, and I have the same thing at the end of every podcast episode. And I think that kind of consistency is really important. So that people who maybe really want to follow your podcast can have that consistency. So editing recordings, like I said, I use Audacity, and that's free. I also think it's very important to use intro and outro or exit music, and you can find a lot of free music clips at PodSafe Music. This is at blueberry.com. And they have a lot of information about PodSafe music. Also, YouTube. Think about YouTube. There's a lot of great tutorials about different softwares. Like I mentioned, Studio One software, and also for Audacity. If there's anything there I need to figure out, usually there is a YouTube training item for that. So like I said, the Podbean annual subscription is $108. You get a lot with that, and it's really a great software. I really enjoyed it. You can see here, actually, I think what I'll do is go in real quickly to, let's see if I can go over to, here we go. Okay, so hopefully you're seeing our website. This is our main website here at the South Carolina State Library. And if I scroll down to the bottom, you can see here's the link for the podcast. And so people would then go to our Library Voices podcast. It gives the RSS feed link right there. It tells you how many downloads to date, how many episodes, gives information. You can see this is just what we have written about what Library Voices SC does. Oh, someone says they're getting a
Yeah, I'm going to
blank
hop on here for
screen.
just a minute. We can't see your
Something isn't
screen
right. Okay,
for some reason.
I'll go right back to the presentation. That's fine. I think it maybe is the setup in Adobe. Can you see
Yes.
my screen now? Okay, all right. I'll just stick with my slides. So you're able to log in and you have your account information in Podbean, and there's a lot that you can do in your screen in the software, and you can see you have a lot of great statistics. You have a dashboard. This tells you like how many followers you have. You can see over on the right. You can see here when I took this screenshot, it tells you, how many have downloaded an episode in the yesterday, the last 7 days, the last 30 days, all time. You can also see usually when you publish, the day you publish a podcast, you'll get a big spike because that's when people are finding out about it and automatically downloading it. Whoops. Okay. And so here there's your list of episodes, all kinds of stuff you can do. Once it's published, you get this share and embed link so that you can actually create code, HTML code, to embed a widget player on a page, which is very nice. I do that every time that I publish a new episode. And you can see more details about all of the downloads and where they're coming from. This is nice information. You can see that we've even had some downloads from Spain, Japan, Germany, Canada, all that kind of stuff. So when I am promoting a episode, you can see this is our main website, and I post this as a news item, and this is where the player is embedded, so I can actually embed this right into the code of the page, and you can see this was an episode about law librarianship. And just a brief description, and I'll put links in here so that people can access it from Podbean, Stitcher, or TuneIn Radio. They can click on other links. And also here's an example of, this was published on Facebook, so you can see how that works there, and other people can like it and find it that way. And then for resources, you can see this is a great article that Brendan Dowling had done October of 2017 about engaging patrons with library podcasts. So obviously it's something that has taken off, and a lot of libraries are doing podcasts now. There's also some great publications like Podcasting for Dummies. You might have that in your own library collection. So definitely look for those kinds of things that will help you. We've also got other books. Here's Starting a Podcast, 10 Proven Steps to Creating Your First Successful Podcast. That's by Jerry Kirshen. And also here's another thing called Podcast Launch, a step-by-step guide on how to launch your podcast. And then also on the 5-Minute Librarian, all you need to know in the time you have, there's a post from July of 2017 about 18 excellent podcasts for librarians. So you can definitely Google this, find a whole lot more information about what kind of library-related podcasts there are. And I definitely encourage folks to check out Library Voices SC. You can find us on Podbean, TuneIn, and Stitcher Radio, all that good stuff. So let's see. Okay, there, I'm at the end, and I think I have left plenty of time for questions. So I'm going to go ahead and try to, and Courtney, if you'll help me with the questions part to make sure that I didn't
Absolutely.
miss anything.
I'm sorry. It looks like we have a spammer there in the chat.
I
I apologize for that. I do want to let everyone know that you will get a copy of the slides. I'll send that out with
Oh, okay. I didn't notice.
the recorded presentation. And we do have some questions. A couple people said freesound.org is a great place for free music and sound effects if you have access to a Mac. GarageBand works. Someone asked about remote interviews. Do you just use the phone for that,
Yes,
or do you
definitely.
ever do Skype?
Yes, actually, I have only used the telephone for that, and we have voice over IP telephones, and we don't have landlines anymore. So the voice over IP telephone is pretty much the best thing for me to use because you want to have a very good connection. But the thing that I really like to do the most is just move that phone over towards that microphone and use the speakerphone. That way it sounds like it's kind of like the best quality that I can get out of a telephone. And I see here, what's the average length of time for each podcast? I like to do it between 20 and 30 minutes. I've had some that some people get in here and it's kind of like pulling teeth. I have to get them to really talk a lot more. And some people I cannot get to be quiet. Sometimes I have had episodes go on to 40, 45 minutes. So generally 30 minutes is kind of the rule of thumb that I use.
A WorldCat list of your materials. And then someone asked, do you allow non-staff members
Oh yeah,
to use
that's a
the
great
sound
idea.
room?
That is something that has recently come up, but I didn't hear back from the person. I was asked if, someone could reserve the room. And I said, we haven't really addressed that yet, but I'll be happy to work with you. Just give me a call. And, if it's something library related, I'll think about it. Certainly we wouldn't do anything that's for profit. And of course, we would look back at our guidelines to see what, if anything could fit in there, or if we did want to, have someone come in and do that. I do know that our local public library, the Richland Library, they do have all the equipment, so I could easily refer people to them. But that is something to think about.
She's wondering if you ever have done a podcast with a child as a guest.
Oh, no, I haven't. That's a very good question. I think that would be very cool, especially if there was something about children's literature or children's books or something. But that's a
And Gail is
great thing to
wondering
think
why you
about.
have 3 microphones.
Oh, why 3 microphones? That's a good question. It was kind of an arbitrary decision, but when I was thinking about it, I know that I kind of always like to have one-on-one conversations, but sometimes there are opportunities where you could interview 2 people. I have had as many as 3 people in an interview, so having that third mic, them being able to move it between themselves, that was really good, because when you've got 3 people on the other side of the table and you're having kind of a group conversation, then that comes in really handy. I've also had a mother and daughter author team. They had written a book here about South Carolina nature preserves and had both of them come in. So me on one mic and they each had a mic, and that worked out perfectly. A lot of times I don't use that third
Okay,
mic, but it
Angela
does come in
says she's been
handy.
told that discussing upcoming programs is not necessarily useful since many people listen to archived episodes. What are your thoughts on that?
I agree. I tend to, anytime I have someone here at the library who is doing a program, I kind of make reference to the fact that they've either done the program or they have an upcoming program, but we don't tend to talk about that program. Um, since they're doing book talks, they kind of have those, in their pocket, and we just kind of go through the same conversation, or their book talk, but we do it as a conversation. So, yeah, I don't think it's a good idea to try to use your podcast to advertise upcoming things, but I do tend to ask authors or people I'm interviewing what they have, any kind of major projects they have coming up in the coming months, just to kind of do it as a wrap
Great.
up, but not
Do you have a
necessarily
release
to
form that
advertise
you
them.
use?
No, I don't have any kind of release form at all. I tend not to worry about that. I do have the statement on our page on the actual Library Voices SC, the Podbean page, that just says all views expressed are those of individuals being interviewed and do not necessarily reflect those of the South Carolina State Library. And
Lana wants
that's
to
it. I
know,
just
how
really
much time
keep
do
it
you spend
simple.
editing your recordings?
It depends on the individual I have interviewed. I have had some folks with very affected ums that need to be removed, if they're talking about some kind of topic. Then that takes a lot of time to go back through and cut out all of those ums, but you're able to see them easily in the software and start taking them out. I tend to, if it's a 30-minute recording, I generally can spend up to an hour editing. So it just depends on the individual. Sometimes I might spend 10 minutes editing. I've had someone come in and they're perfectly eloquent and need no editing at all except adding in the intro and the extra music. Um, so that's, just kind of runs the gamut.
So kind of a follow-up question to that. Lana also says, I'm just trying to determine the time commitment involved.
Time commitment involved. I think if you're going to get out of it what you put into it, basically. It's kind of like with social media. It's also kind of like with a free puppy or a free kitten. It's free because you're not buying it, but then you have to feed it and take care of it. So, um, if I see our stats kind of going down, or not thinking about the podcast, then it's going to tend to kind of drift off. But if I just plan ahead, like a month or two at a time, and do maybe working on the script that might take a half an hour to an hour, doing the actual recording, I block an hour of time for that. And then for the editing, I block an hour. So maybe each podcast episode could be up to 3 hours, if you
I'm
want to
kind
look
of
at it that way.
interested, just to follow up with that, how many people are involved in the podcast process, or is it just you?
It is pretty much just me. Again, that also keeps it simple. I tend to, again, engage our own staff and ask them, just even in passing, hey, do you have any ideas for podcast episodes? Or I saw you've got this coming up. Do you think that person would be interested in coming in to talk with me for the podcast? And just kind of go about it that way. I just keep it very simple.
Great. Okay, I'm looking through here for some more questions. We need to wrap up. We're at about an hour. I'm going to move over to the LEU pod. You can download your LEU for this presentation. Also take the survey there, and the survey link is in the middle of the page. And then we also have the presenter contact information. It doesn't look like we're going to get to all of the questions that you have, but I will compile those and have Dr. Rogers answer those and send those out with the recording as well as the copy of the slides. So if you have a question that you didn't get answered or haven't asked yet, feel free to stick that in the chat box. Again, I apologize for that spam we have going on there. We'll try to figure that out, and then we'll get those questions answered. So I want to thank Dr. Curtis Rogers again for presenting for us. This is great information.
Thank you. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And also, everyone, you've got my email address. Feel free to email me. I'm more than happy to get back in touch with you if it's a question that I can answer.
Great, thank you. I'll stay on for just a couple more minutes. I will leave the LEU up. Be sure to download that. Get your questions in the chat box if you haven't already. And I will send out a copy of the presentation either late this week or next week. Thanks everyone for coming.